Hi, I'm Jim Hightower, and I'm hoping that you will tune in to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour because it will turn you radioactive.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. How you doing today, David?
Scared.
A little scared. Yeah, I can understand that. And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve. How are you?
I'm just as scared as David, if not more. And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. Listen, courage is the coin of a democratic realm, small d. As Aristotle said, it's the fundamental virtue that makes other virtues possible.
Our first guest today is Chris Hedges. He has had a Pulitzer Prize-winning career as a war correspondent in just about every hotspot you could name: the Middle East, Central America, the Balkans. His reporting is unsparing in its critique of American foreign policy. In his new book, Genocide Foretold, Reporting on Survival and Resistance in Occupied Palestine, Chris Hedges, quote, confronts the stark realities of life under siege in Gaza and the heroic effort ordinary Palestinians are waging to resist and survive. We'll speak to him about his book, his reporting from the occupied territories, and what this unwavering support for Netanyahu's genocide tells us about the American empire. Then we turn from tragedy to farce when we welcome David Swanson of World Beyond War to give us his take on how the Democratic Party could save itself. He's got a 10-point plan. We'll also speak to him about what his organization is doing to resist this country's casual acceptance of being constantly at war. Finally, we'll welcome back our resident constitutional scholar, Bruce Fein, for an update on the daily high crimes and misdemeanors of the Trump administration. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's hear a first-hand report on survival and resistance in occupied Palestine. David?
Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He's the host of the Chris Hedges Report, and he's a prolific author. His most recent book is A Genocide Foretold, Reporting on Survival and Resistance in Occupied Palestine. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Chris Hedges.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. To say this is a gripping book is an understatement. You really know how to write, Chris, from all your years of observation of the horrors that are inflicted on civilians by dictatorships and sadistic military attacks. And listeners should know that what's in this book is documented by at least 16 Israeli human rights groups, including veterans such as Break the Silence Group, including Rabbis for Human Rights, including the great civil liberties organization B'Tselem. And that should be always stated because the documentation in this book is overwhelmingly meticulous. The history, the primary materials, and the observation firsthand. So let me start with this, Chris. I think our listeners need to get a flavor of how you write and why you write. Can you read a short section at the beginning of your book?
Writing and photographing in wartime are acts of resistance, acts of faith. They affirm the belief that one day, a day the writers, journalists, and photographers may never see, the words and images will evoke empathy, understanding, outrage, and provide wisdom. They chronicle not only the facts, although facts are important, but the texture, sacredness, and grief of lives and communities lost. They tell the world what war is like, how those caught in its maw of death endure, how there are those who sacrifice for others and those who do not, what fear and hunger are like, what death is like. They transmit the cries of children, the wails of grief of the mothers, the daily struggle in the face of savage industrial violence, the triumph of their humanity through filth, sickness, humiliation, and fear. This is why writers, photographers, and journalists are targeted by aggressors in war, including the Israelis, for obliteration. They stand as witnesses to evil an evil the aggressors want buried and forgotten. They expose the lies. They condemn, even from the grave, their killers. Israel has killed at least 13 Palestinian poets and writers, with at least 200 journalists and media workers in Gaza and 3 in Lebanon since October 7th. I experienced futility and outrage when I covered war. I wondered if I had done enough or if it was even worth the risk. But you go on, because to do nothing is to be complicit. You report because you care. You will make it hard for the killers to deny their crimes.
Chris Hedges, explain why there are no U.S. reporters, European reporters, Asian reporters, Israeli reporters allowed into Gaza.
Because Israel wants to hide the genocide. They want to hide the horror. They don't want daily reports by Western media outlets that show images and give a voice to those who are being savagely killed. Remember that since October 7th, Israel has dropped the equivalent of, in terms of bomb tonnage, of 2 nuclear weapons on Gaza. Gaza is 20 miles long and 5 miles wide. We have not seen in a concentrated form this kind of obliteration of an area, perhaps since the bombing of Dresden or Hamburg or something in the Second World War. In terms of tonnage, yes, maybe in Vietnam, but that was over a much wider area. And that is also why Israel is carrying out targeted assassinations of these courageous Palestinian reporters who work for Al Jazeera. One was just killed, I think, yesterday, and other media outlets. They want to block the story. That's not new. In every war I covered, it was the same. For instance, when I covered the war in Bosnia, and the Bosnian Serbs would go into a village and carry out a massacre, or was also true in Kosovo, they would block the roads. We'd have to walk in as journalists with our satellite phones, and often we would be fired on by snipers. That was true in the war in El Salvador, and the Israelis, of course, to the extent that they can, they want to hide the crimes that they're committing.
Well, long before October 7th, you were covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine where you witnessed something you said you never witnessed before in terms of the deliberate targeting of children. Can you explain that? That was, I think, over 30 years ago.
Yes, that's correct. I was doing a magazine piece for Harper's, and with the great cartoonist Joe Sacco, who did the book Footnotes in Gaza, book Palestine. This was around 2000. And we wrote a piece, and he drew it out, called A Gaza Diary, where we spent 10 days in the refugee camp in Han Yunis. And I'm an Arabic speaker. The kids were getting out of school. And I heard over the loudspeaker that there were still settlers, Jewish colonists who lived in Gaza. And of course, that is the plan now. When they evacuate Gaza, they're quite open about it, resettling these Jewish colonists in at least northern Gaza, if not all of Gaza. So I heard these words, ta'al, ta'al, which means come in Arabic. And then I heard other words, which I won't repeat, but curse words. They baited the boys. They, come on, dogs, they would say. Where are all the dogs of Han Yunis? Come, come, along with other stuff. And so these boys, I'm talking about 10-year-old kids, they went up, they were baited, provoked, and they started lobbing rocks towards 2 armored jeeps that were parked on the top of the dune, mounted with these loudspeakers. And then I heard and saw percussion grenade explosions. The boys scattered and ran. And it's interesting, I didn't hear the sound of gunfire. Kids got shot, but they put silencers on their weapons. They had silencers on M16. And then later I visited the boys in the hospital. Their stomachs had been ripped out, gaping holes in their limbs and torsos. And I had their names. I had the time, the date. It was incontrovertible. I was heavily attacked by the Zionists and their supporters, including in the media. And as I said, I had covered many wars, but I'd never seen a moment where children were baited into a trap and murdered.
Chris, you've written a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict's impact on the U.S., the Congress, public budgets, military weapon shipments, collaboration over military matters. Tell our listeners your concern in the coming months about the further impact of this Israeli war in Gaza on our country?
There are two, I think maybe three things I worry about. First, the way that criticism of the genocide has been used to further the interests of the authoritarian state. Very cynically, because, of course, many of these people, especially in the Christian right, I wrote a book about them, American Fascists, the Christian right in the war, in America are anti-Semites. Secondly, our standing globally. We have kind of exposed ourselves as not caring at all about the Geneva Convention or the rule of law. I mean, we didn't care about it in Iraq. I'm not pretending we did, or Vietnam, but at least as a utopian ideal, a recognition that it was important. That's been eviscerated. We not only blocked the effort by most countries on the globe to halt the genocide, or at least censure Israel to the genocide, but of course have continued to send billions of dollars in weapons and to shut down critics within the United States, as well as criminalizing the ICC, I mean, justices who are trying to hold Israel to account. And that sends a very, very ominous message to the global South, especially as the climate breaks down, that these are the kind of draconian, murderous measures that we will employ. Because remember, what Palestinians endure in places like Gaza, which before this assault was just an open-air prison, the lack of state documents, the constant control, surveillance, the concertina wire, everything, that's what migrants fleeing towards Europe or coming over the border from Mexico, that's exactly the experience they face. So I think it presages a very frightening world order, and it presages or has been used effectively to further the interests of Trump's crypto-fascist state.
We're speaking with Chris Hedges, the author of the brand new book, A Genocide Foretold, reporting on survival and resistance in Occupied Palestine by the Seven Stories Press. And his most recent book before that is a real gripper. It's called The Greatest Evil is War. And he wrote another book before that, What Every Person Should Know About War. And so let's leave you with this question. The CIA and the Department of Defense have been developing scenarios of what they call blowback from U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and now Israel-Palestine. They are worried about blowback. In an age of ever more inexpensive, armed, unmanned drones that can be built in garages and are reflecting further innovation in this area by the Ukrainian technologists, for example, in their fight against Russia and Putin. Are you worried about blowback? And if you are worried about blowback, don't you think that would further the fascism and the police state crackdown in the U.S.?
Yes, of course it would, in the same way that 9/11 eviscerated civil liberties under the Patriot Act and pushed us into the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, I mean, how can you not expect blowback? We talked earlier about Abdulaziz Rantisi as a boy in 1956, co-founder of Hamas, who I knew, watching his neighbors and his relatives being executed in cold blood by the Israelis. And that moment radicalized him. You have traumatized an entire generation of Palestinians, including, of course, Palestinian children. And they don't have an air force. They don't have mechanized units. They don't have a navy. They don't have artillery. They don't have all the things a modern, sophisticated army like Israel has. And so they do it through suicide bombings. I'm no fan of suicide bombings. I covered them in the 1980s in Jerusalem. But blowback is inevitable. It's inevitable, given the savagery that has been visited upon the Palestinians and the utter indifference of every country in the world, with the exception of Yemen.
Well, given Donald Trump's belligerent and violent political language, his incitation to his followers against any protest, it's really a horrifying prospect, because if there is any blowback, if there isn't something like a 9/11, he's going to take advantage of it and move even deeper into a tyrannical fascist dictatorship. And he knows how to do it, probably better than anybody else.
The people around him know how to do it. I mean, unlike the first Trump administration, which was chaotic and unfocused, they're totally prepared. Yes, of course, Ralph, it would be a gift, the Trump administration, but I also think that it's almost certainly inevitable at some point.
Which is another illustration that foreign policy and domestic policy are intertwined, and the impact of this expanding belligerency in the Middle East is coming back to haunt us. The one thing I liked about your book especially is the historical context, how widely read you are, the wars in Europe and how they related to the migration to Palestine, how Jews in Europe were used by the British to get rid of them by the Balfour Declaration, saying that they could have a homeland in Palestine. And so one way I want to convey to our listeners the sense of history in your book is to ask you a question, which is, who was Uri Avneri?
Uri Avneri, who I knew was an amazing Israeli journalist who, as a young man, joined these terrorist Zionist groups that attacked Palestinians. He used to say, "Don't talk to me about terrorists. I was one." He saw, like Yeshayahu Leibowitz, for instance, the great Israeli philosopher, what this occupation was doing to Israel, how it was turning Israel into a kind of quasi-fascist state that in many ways replicated the racism and dehumanization of fascist entities, including the Nazis. He spent his life working to build bridges. He was in the Knesset for a while, build bridges with the Palestinians, meeting with Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO in Beirut. Yeah, he was one of these prophets within Israel, like Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who understood decades really before it's happened where Israel would end up and where it has ended up.
Let's go to Steve.
Chris, how do you see this playing out? Do you think Israel's really going to be able to kill or displace all the Palestinians in this project?
We know the intent. The intent is to depopulate Gaza, at the very least, to depopulate northern Gaza and turn it over to Jewish colonists. And I think that the complete blockage, now over 2 weeks, of all food and humanitarian aid, the cutting of electricity, which means the last desalination plant no longer functions. So people are getting sick from fetid water and raw sewage and everything. This is, in Israel's eyes, the last chapter of the genocide. Israel Katz, the defense minister, it has publicly made this clear. And they will make life so onerous and so brutal because all of this starvation and sickness is being accompanied by attacks, although I want to note that since the ceasefire began, before Israel began bombing again on March 18th, 137 at least Palestinians have been killed by Israel. So they violated the ceasefire from the beginning. They are now going to make a push to drive them out. That will put a lot of pressure on Egypt, a lot of pressure on Jordan. There are talks with Somaliland, with Sudan, with other places that may take Palestinians. That's the goal. Whether that intent will be realized, my fear is that the only way it could be blocked is for the United States to block it by withholding support and arms. That's not going to happen. So it's a very, very ominous chapter in the history of historic Palestine, in some ways far worse even than the 1948 Nakba, or catastrophe, that saw massacres carried out against Palestinians in their villages and 750,000 Palestinians displaced. What we're watching now is probably the worst catastrophe to ever beset the Palestinian people.
Let's go to David.
Ralph talked about blowback. The Houthis in Yemen are attacking U.S. ships in the Red Sea, specifically because of America's support for Israel in Gaza. And Donald Trump launched airstrikes on Houthis in Yemen about 10 days ago. According to Reuters, America killed 53 and 5 children. 5 children. And right now, anybody in the Western press is talking about is the White House group chat in the lead up to that attack. Nothing about the 5 children reportedly killed. I've heard some say, well, Houthis used child soldiers, so this was inevitable. Could you speak to the possibility that these airstrikes killed 5 children and zero discussion about the 5 children?
Yeah, I mean, the whole, remember, these attacks on Yemen, the U.S. supported, carried out by Saudi Arabia, it caused widespread death, famine, everything else. I think that's one of the reasons Yemen has reacted to what's happening in Gaza. I mean, the Houthis have just been effectively demonized within public discourse, so it doesn't really matter how many you kill. But as you point out, the Houthis managed to disrupt the maritime traffic, which is vital for Israel. And so it saw the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan create a land corridor. When I was in Jordan last summer, you could see hundreds of trucks literally going through the King Hussein Bridge into the West Bank and into Israel to essentially make up for the loss of agricultural products, consumer goods. And that is part of the anger towards especially the Jordanian government for its complicity, in essence, sustaining Israel during the genocide. But within the Arab world, and I've spent quite a bit of time in the Arab world since October 7th, there's a deep rage on the streets over the failure on the part of Arab regimes, such as the Jordanian regime, the Egyptian regime, and others, the Saudis, to intervene to stop the slaughter, and a great admiration for the Yemenis.
Hannah?
I'm looking at the Kirkus review of your book, and it calls it a furious attack on the Israeli state. It refers to your hyperbolic accusations and says, if you're looking for nuance, you won't find it here. What's your response to that criticism? If you're looking for nuance, you won't find it here.
Well, it's a bit like attacking somebody for writing about Auschwitz and not giving the SS guards enough play to voice their side. We're writing about a genocide, and frankly, there isn't a lot of nuance. There's a lot of context, which is in the book, but I expect either to be blanked out or attacked, because lifting up the voices of Palestinians is something at this point within American society that is considered by the dominant media platforms and those within positions of power to be unacceptable. It was a slam against my book. I speak Arabic. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. If anyone understands nuance and context, I do. This is not a tract in any way endorsing Hamas or any other group, frankly. But yeah, I expect those kinds of attacks.
On that note, on page 84, Chris Hedges, you summarize some of the questions that should be asked the American people, because this conflict is affecting America down to the local communities, not just suppression of free speech, but many other distortions of what a democratic society should be producing for its people instead of funding empires abroad. And I want to read the last paragraph on page 84. Quote, young men and women sign up for the military for many reasons, but starving, bombing, and killing women and children is usually not amongst them. Shouldn't, in a just world, the U.S. fleet break the Israeli blockade of Gaza to provide food, shelter, and medicine? Shouldn't the U.S. warplanes impose a no-fly zone over Gaza to halt the saturation bombing? Shouldn't Israel be issued an ultimatum to withdraw its forces from Gaza? Shouldn't the weapons shipments, billions in military aid and intelligence provided to Israel be halted? Shouldn't those who commit genocide, as well as those who support genocide, be held accountable? End quote. That's what this book is all about. It eventually comes down to us, the American people. And it's not just the Middle East. It's a sprawling empire with hundreds of military bases, sapping the energy of our public budgets and of our ability to relate in an empathetic and humanitarian way to the rest of the world. Tell us how people can contact your Substack before we conclude, Chris Hedges.
chrishedges.substack.com. And the point you make is an important one, Ralph. Thucydides made it in his History of the Peloponnesian War, the expansion of the Athenian Empire, when he wrote that the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself.
The book is A Genocide Foretold, reporting on survival and resistance in occupied Palestine by Chris Hedges. 7 Stories Press is the publisher. Thank you very much, Chris Hedges.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Chris Hedges. We will link to his new book, A Genocide Foretold, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, we will welcome David Swanson, co-founder of World Beyond War. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, March 28, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The White House wants to recruit corporate sponsors to contribute to its Easter egg roll next month, raising ethical and legal concerns that President Trump is allowing companies to profit from the 147-year-old tradition by turning it into a showcase for their brands. The financial backers of the April 21 event would be able to choose from three options that cost between $75,000 and $200,000, according to a 9-page guide for potential sponsors that was reviewed by the New York Times. The most expensive package includes a corporate booth, logo placements, branded snacks or beverages, exclusive tickets to brunch with the First Lady, a chance to engage with the White House press corps, a private White House tour, and 150 tickets to the event. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our next guest has some pretty strong opinions about what the Democratic Party needs to do to actually serve the American people. David?
David Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, radio host, and Nobel Peace Prize nominee. He is executive director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator for Roots Action. His books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, David Swanson.
No place I'd rather be. Thank you.
David, you are the preeminent activist for peace and against war in our country. And on February 23 of 2025 and surrounding days, your group organized all around the world in a coordinated action to call for the closure of all military bases as part of the Global Day of Action to close bases. And that's just one example of what you're all about throughout these years and your group called World Beyond War. Just for introduction, why is there so much popular support for war-making activities and not so much support for peacemaking activities? Or is that not true?
Well, there's truth and misconception in there. When you poll people and you show them what the budget looks like, most people want to move it out of war and into education and into housing and so forth. Same with city governments. When they find out how much goes to police, they want to move it. But most people have not got a clue that's happening. There's not a lot of honest polling done, and people are pretty hopeless about stopping wars. They know there's not an anti-war party in Washington, D.C. They know that the indoctrination and the propaganda is overwhelming. I mean, the biggest scandal of the past 2 days in the United States is not government officials secretly discussing plans for mass killing, for war making, but how they did it on a group chat. You can imagine if they were talking about blowing up buildings in the United States, at least the victims would get a little mention in there in the stories about the group chats, right? So the media is very, very accepting of war making. And if you want to be in the media, you have to be very accepting of war making. And so there is a lot more peace activism than we're told. And there's a lot more belief and support for peacemaking than we're told. But there is not nearly enough, not nearly what there should be.
They seem to be addicted, the media, to violent spectacles to report on, where if you have a major convention for peace and you're waging peace and you spell it all out in terms of how it enhances and improves people's lives and security, they don't cover it. I've noted again and again that the Friends Committee on National Legislation, with its chapters all over the country, those are the Quakers, and they have an active presence every day on Congress with their lobbyists, very, very little press. Whereas, some violent, vituperative statement by Tom Cotton or Lindsey Graham, and it gets a lot of press. So there's this problem with the media, sort of recalls the book that once was titled, If It Bleeds, It Leads. Like in the evening news, they start with the street crimes. If it bleeds, it leads. Now, I want to do something I've never asked any of our guests. David, I want you to read your short column on March 20th, 2025, titled A Challenge to the Democratic Party?
Be glad to. So this read, Dear Democratic Party, your new approach, and this was hyperlinked to a New York Times story about the latest recruiter of new Democratic candidates. Your new approach strikes me as not terribly different from your old approach. Would this be a fair and accurate summary of your new approach? Make any corrections or additions you like, please. 1, have no policy platform. 2, be pro-war military veterans. 3, be accepting of the Republican agenda. 4, seem authentic and humble. 5, tolerate stupidity well. I'm not trying to slant it. Again, change it and expand it however you like. Got it perfected? Want to toss in any of this toxic, insightful collection of wisdom? And here I linked to a strategy paper from certain Democrats. All right, now, here's a challenge. I challenge you to poll people on which approach they prefer, yours or mine. Here's mine. 1, identify so-called campaign contributions as legalized bribery. Accept none. Count on voters to find you the way they find millions of things they actually like, and work night and day through every possible means to criminalize bribery and publicly fund elections. 2, invest heavily in public education, make college free. 3, create universal, comprehensive single-payer health coverage. 4, abolish corporate welfare. 5, restore progressive taxation, getting the top marginal rate on people and corporations back to 90%, restore the estate tax, lift the cap on Social Security taxes, and eliminate income taxes on most people who work for a living. 6, legalize unionizing. 7, bust monopolies, including in media and social media. 8, do a massive Green New Deal. 9, cut funding 20% per year to the military and to mass incarceration until they're gone. 10, turn the presidency back into the constitutional executive, the Supreme Court back into a court, and the Congress back into a functioning legislature. What do you think? Yes, I've got 10 things and you've only got 5, so feel free to add your favorite additional 5, whatever you want. No need to run them by me. I trust you. Now, do the polling and tell me who wins. If I lose, I'll kiss Chuck Schumer's ass, scream "Peace is anti-Semitism" from my roof, and buy a "Some of my best friends are billionaires" shirt. But if you lose, you'll do what I tell you from now on. Deal?
And what was the reaction from the Democratic Party?
Yes, I think they're still working on it. They're having some group chats about it to figure out how to respond. Haven't quite heard from them yet.
As we record this program, listeners, several people are demonstrating in front of the Democratic National Committee headquarters down near Capitol Hill in a unique way. They're basically saying to the Democratic Party, stop closing down input from civic groups on many issues, domestic and foreign. Stop closing out inputs from progressive unions and get rid of your corporate consultants that have turned your party into a commercial operation, harboring lucrative Trojan horses who decide how you campaign, when you campaign, what you campaign over, and who's going to raise money for your coffers. There's passing out a report that we put together, David, in 2022 called Crushing the GOP 2022, which could have been used for 2024, as well as a handout that describes once again that the new head of the Democratic National Committee, Ken Martin from Minnesota, who promised reforms, has continued not responding to important requests and important proposals and demands to meet by citizen groups and labor groups with Democratic National Committee officials. So here we go again. Your column was an update. Nothing has changed. What do you foresee when you basically have such a weak opposition party that should have been landsliding the worst GOP in history? What do you foresee for the Trumpsters and the Musketeers in the coming months as they entrench a fascist dictatorship with police state manifestations already in the United States of America.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you are supporting that protest and handing out that information and that people are protesting at the DNC. I know my colleague, Sam Rosenthal from Roots Action, was headed over there, and we encouraged everyone we could to get over there. Roots Action has also written up autopsies. Each year, the Democrats lose big elections, and they don't read them and they don't act on them. They allow groups like AIPAC to take Republican money and buy Democratic primaries, determining who's going to run as a Democrat. And they really don't care. You have, these record-sized rallies now with Bernie and AOC. But as far as I can tell, people just come to the rallies and listen and cheer and go home. There ought to be such a rally in front of the DNC. There ought to be such a rally on the grounds of Capitol Hill with Bernie and AOC, if that's what it takes to get people to come out to a rally. But then they ought to be told not to leave until the U.S. government becomes responsive to majority will and representative and law-abiding, for goodness sake. And when the country is screaming for the so-called leader of the minority in the U.S. Senate to give somebody else a try who we can then hold accountable as well to a basic effort of trying to oppose the Republican agenda, he's got to do it. The Democrats are the least popular they've been. They're way less popular than the Republicans because some of the Republicans' supporters actually support the horrendous behavior they're engaged in, whereas Democrats want somebody to try anything at all. And you're not getting it. Your people have to interrupt. My friends from Code Pink have to interrupt hearings to be heard at all. And then you have senators denouncing them as being paid by China, which obviously they are not, but that's just the proper thing to say these days. If you disagree with someone, they're paid by China. So the brightest light I see maybe is Bernie telling people to run as non-Democrats, and all the people who are getting involved for the first time. I mean, people who've never done activism are asking me, should I get involved in activism now? How do you do that? It seems about time, or pretty soon it'll be time for me to ask you, how do we do activism? This is encouraging.
What is encouraging is the turnout at these town meetings around the country, including Republican members of Congress, facing an outraged and incisively demanding audience in the auditorium, and they're taken aback by this. The people are way ahead of the politicians in Congress on what Trump is doing to this country and where this country is heading, and that's very encouraging. But what is not encouraging is that the Democrats at town meetings are not absorbing the energy of the demanding audience in front of them. Senator Bennett of Colorado had a town meeting recently, and he's got a relatively safe seat, Democrat, and he was wishy-washy. He wasn't standing there as a formidable leader. He was just saying, what do you all think? So near the end, a woman stands up and she says to him, why is your party always on the defensive? Democrats are always on the defensive. When are you going to have a comprehensive plan and go on the offensive? He started rambling, and then he said, yeah, I agree with you. And then another person stands up and said, every day, Senator, I hear what Trump is doing is called unconstitutional, 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 unconstitutional. What does all this amount to? And instead of saying what it should amount to is impeachment in the House and removal in the Senate, he basically said, well, I think people should push back. And then he closed off the meeting. So this is a kind of mealy-mouthed behavior by the Democrats facing the most mortal threat to our democratic society and constitutional rights in the history of the country, barring the Civil War. And they're not projecting strength. So we're left with the old statement, when the people lead, the politicians will cover. And you're helping the people lead. I want you to describe the activities of World Beyond War, give the website, of course, with chapters all over the world that's really active in waging peace.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, Ralph, that it's encouraging that people are being confronted and that routine hijinks like pretending you oppose bills and not really trying to stop them and not stopping them on procedural votes is being called out, when I thought there was an obligation to not look at that stuff, that people like Schumer are being called out on it. And it's a little bit encouraging that the courts are more representative than the so-called representatives, and that people who actually do have a plan are speaking up. But what World Beyond War does globally is educational and activist work toward the end of eventually eliminating wars and eliminating militaries and eliminating military spending and directing it into useful things, which is a very small d democratic initiative. The problem is not so much that we don't have the people of the world on our side as that we don't have the governments of the world on our side. So the Day to Close Bases that you mentioned, daytoclosebases.org, you can check it out. We had dozens of protest and disruption and educational and artistic actions around the world all on the same day aimed at closing bases. We're now starting to plan a day of media around closed bases, which I think you'd like, as we're going to use all the techniques of letters and op-eds and press conferences and creative stunts to generate media attention to the issue, because just doing huge rallies around the world all on the same day doesn't get the corporate media. If it's not an issue in Washington, D.C., they don't want to hear about it. So that's what World Beyond War does. It does educational work and it does activist work toward eliminating war. And there are steps along the way, like eliminating bases. Why does the United States need over 900 bases in other people's countries? What good do they do you as a citizen of the United States? When Tulsi Gabbard on Tuesday comes before Congress and says not a word about the dangers of nuclear war or environmental collapse or disease or poverty or artificial intelligence that Elon Musk says is going to kill us all soon, but the dangers are China and Russia and Iran, and the danger is that they're competitors and rivals. What ill for struggling citizens of the United States about to be evicted from their homes stay up at night worrying that China is a competitor to the United States economically or culturally or militarily. This is the nonsense you get out of Washington, D.C., and why we need a major, major change in direction.
Are you working with Veterans for Peace, which has 100 chapters around the country? They do a lot of demonstrations and nonviolent civil disobedience.
Yes, very much so. I'm on the advisory board of Veterans for Peace, though I'm not a veteran, and they are one of the best groups there is in the United States and a little bit outside of the United States as well. And they do great work in activism and in education, in organizing around the environmental destruction of wars and even of air shows. We're trying to shut down all these wasteful and destructive air shows around the United States. A tremendous group, Veterans for Peace, and you can join and support it whether you're a veteran or not.
Let's go to David.
David, there are those who believe war is a constant in nature and that America should be in a constant state of war. Otherwise, we get weak. Do people openly say that in the corridors of power? We don't get to hear that, but are there people in our Pentagon, in our military-industrial complex, who will privately say, unless we're constantly at war, we will be vulnerable?
Well, they certainly say it publicly in books and webinars, and peace activists say the same exact thing on webinars. Most peace activists only oppose a particular war, not the whole industry of war. This is what is different about a group like World Beyond War. We're trying to go after the entire industry. But when you take this little corner of the globe, this 4% of humanity that's called the United States, and note that it's almost constantly got its government at war, and you compare it with the other 96%, most of which usually does not, and you say, oh, well, it's just human nature, can't be helped. Well, aren't those other 96% of people humans too? How do you get to define human nature as an imperialist decree based on what the misrepresentative government of 4% of people do? People survive just fine without war. You know how many cases across the world, across the decades, in every hospital and health center there are of PTSD or any sort of injury from war deprivation? Not a one, not a single one ever. People survive just fine, and people do their damnedest to stay out of it, even in the most warmongering nations in the world. people try their very hardest to stay out of war personally, because it does great damage. It does great damage if you're sitting there in a trailer in Nevada pushing a button, killing people 5,000 miles away, or if you're directly in it and it comes back. In a couple months, we're going to bring a group of victims of military veteran domestic violence to Washington, D.C. to seek compensation, because the rates of domestic violence are much, much higher if you've been in war. It's not something that does well with humans. So this notion that, well, it's natural, whatever that means, you have to have it. When you've had human societies that have gone centuries and millennia without it and done just fine, and nobody prior to the past 50 or 100 years has had anything that resembled what war looks like today. This notion that we're just stuck with it, like poverty and cable news networks, it's not true. We can do away with it if we want to.
Hannah?
Circling back to the group chat, War Council, I think one of the kind of visceral responses to it is, how dare they be so casual as to not double check who's in the group? But what we don't see is a lot of these big decisions that kill people are made by guys, I'll say guys, people who are pretty casual about state-sanctioned violence. Can you talk about the difference between interpersonal pacifism versus state pacifism? I like to say I have no problem with interpersonal violence. I'll punch you if you attack me, but I'm pacifist when it comes to state violence. I don't know. There's something about the chat that I think speaks to how these guys just muddle interpersonal conflict with state-sanctioned violence.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I've done debates with West Point professors and war supporters on the question of, can a war ever be justified? And for the most part, they never want to talk about war at all. They want to talk about what I would do in a dark alley when my grandmother's being attacked. Wouldn't I fight back, or am I a pacifist? Because they don't want to make that distinction that you've already made in the question between what someone might do in an alley with their grandmother and the mass organization of destruction on a scale that no single person can ever accomplish, that is war. This is what there's no excuse for, no justification for. Preparing and building up to it is counterproductive and does not make us safer. And I really don't care how they talk about it, but it's interesting that publicly, it's always this last resort and this solemn, regretful duty to save the world, whereas privately, it's fire burning and fist emojis and Yahoo, kill 'em boys. And so it is helpful to make that public. We ought to all be asking, as members of the U.S. public, to be in all the group chats. They ought not to have secrets. They do this stuff in the name of democracy, the point of which is to not have secrets. So I'm not bothered by who they let in. I don't think it's accurate to call this guy a journalist, but I'm not bothered that they let him in. But the fact that they have secrets, and that the secrets are about war plans, which are crimes, and the universal assumption by all parties, including across political parties, that the war crimes justify the secrecy and justify the austerity and justify the deportations and justify the surveillance and justify the military spending. War plans don't justify any of this stuff. They are declarations of intent to commit a crime, and this is why they want it secret. But for Elizabeth Warren to be outraged at the unprofessional secrecy and how the group chat was shared, rather than at the existence of secrets or at the existence of planning the worst crime there is, this is the problem, to my mind. And of course, for a journalist to be told they're about to bomb buildings and kill dozens of people, and here's when and where, and for him not to do what Catherine Gunn tried to do before the war in Iraq and try to prevent it, go public then, as Dan Ellsberg said a whistleblower should do, is go public beforehand, try to prevent the crime. No, Jeffrey Goldberg ran and got a bowl of popcorn and sat back to watch the killing. And then afterwards, not only went public, but took himself off the group chat so he couldn't possibly learn what they were going to do next, to which country they target next. So this is the opposite of governance combined with the opposite of journalism and a non-scandal around the edges.
Wait, he left the chat?
Yes, he proudly removed himself from the chat so that as they make their next plans for a bigger war, he can't possibly commit the offense of learning about them, what a journalist is supposed to do as a journalist.
Before we conclude, David, you co-founded World Beyond War in 2014, and you have chapters all over the world. Tell us how World Beyond War is funded and how people can get more information on your website.
Yes, co-founded, by the way, with another David Hartsoe, whom we lost this week to cancer at the age of 84, a man who was part of every activist movement around the world from the early days of the civil rights movement in the United States to the present day, and he will be badly missed. But World Beyond War is at worldbeyondwar.org. You can click on donate. You can make a donation. That's where most of our funding comes from. No, we don't get funded by any governments or any weapons dealers or any secret Chinese groups. We get a small number of grants, and we get mostly funded by individuals who want to create a movement to abolish war making.
And worldbeyondwar.org is a nonprofit organization for which contributions are deductible?
That's correct. In the United States, it's a 501c3 as long as those are permitted to continue to do their work.
And is there any publication or book that you want to bring to the attention of our readers?
Oh, we have several books from World Beyond War as well as from myself. If you go to World Beyond War and click on education and click on books, I recommend all of them. We also do book clubs with authors, and we appreciate all the writing you do, Ralph Nader, recommending great books. So we hope you keep doing that.
As we say, readers think and thinkers read. Have you been invited to testify before Congress recently, David?
Afraid I have not. I would be happy to. Again, my friends have to disrupt committee hearings to ask basic questions. Also happening on Tuesday, there was a hearing to consider the nomination of arguably certifiably insane nominee for ambassador to Israel, who believes that Israel should be utterly destroyed in order to bring back Jesus Christ. And nobody asked him about it. My senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, asked him, "Do you believe that Palestinians have a right to live?" And then interrupted himself and turned to ask a different nominee a question and never let the guy respond. I would love to testify before Congress. I'd also like to step in and ask a few questions for them of the people who are testifying, because they don't even do that.
Thank you very much, David Swanson. You've been at it a long time. You're a long-range marathon runner for peace.
We've been speaking with David Swanson. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Stand up, stand up.
Now, let's check in with our resident constitutional scholar, Bruce Fein, for an update on the daily high crimes and misdemeanors of the Trump administration.
Welcome back, Bruce. We want you to focus on what the Trump administration is doing to Columbia University, other universities on the waiting list for a similar attack, and to these big corporate law firms. Who would ever think that the Trumpsters would go after these big corporate law firms? But the commentary is uniformly negative in the mainstream press, criticizing what Trump is doing as suppressing free speech. But you think it goes deeper than that in terms of our criminal laws. Can you explain?
Yes, it's extortion when you demand money or something of value, threatening sanctions for standing on your own rights. And so when we have Mr. Trump approaching a very large law firm, we'll call it Paul Weiss, saying, listen, I will permit you to have contracts with the federal government. Persons who work with you can work for the federal government. I will not strip you of security clearances, and I will not bar you from occupying or stepping a foot in federal buildings. Now, if you will go ahead and give my favorite nonprofit enterprises $40 million worth of pro bono services, it's like becoming an indentured servant for $40 million worth. This is something that he has no right to do as president. If there were really an attorney general who was independent, they would advise the president, you can't make these threats. They are the equivalent of extortion.
And extortion is both a crime and a serious tort or wrongful injury. Now, under the Supreme Court decision last June, he can get away with this in terms of not being criminally prosecuted, but he is not immune from a civil lawsuit. like the women who have sued him for sexual assault. Is that correct?
Well, no, I think it's a little bit different, Ralph. Even prior to the decision in Trump versus U.S., this case goes back to our old friend Ernie Fitzgerald, who sued Nixon because they fired him because he was disclosing the cost overruns. I think it was the C5A. And in a 5-4 decision, the court said that you're immune from any damages suit for any action you arguably take within your role as president. So if you add the Fitzgerald case to the decision last July 1st on Trump v. U.S., there's no way you can sue him for damages, for extortion.
Either criminally or civil.
Yeah, he's not going to prosecute himself. In civil, the Fitzgerald case combined with Trump v. U.S. blocks them.
On that note, we've been talking with Bruce Fein, author of very prescient books and often interviewed by the BBC, and in many ways, one of the most prolific letter to the editor writers to the Washington Post, New York Times, and a frequent guest on our program. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you.
I want to thank our guests again, Chris Hedges, David Swanson, and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show for you podcast listeners. Stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question in this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. And join all the people who are obtaining the Capitol Citizen. Go to capitolcitizen.com for a donation of $5 or more. You will get it by return mail. 40 pages packed with unofficial journalism about Congress and helping you make an entry into the role of a Capitol Hill citizen yourself.
Stand up. Oh, you should. Step up. I think